So thus far we haven't progressed too much into our game, so let's work on that. I'll get rid of that old code up there of the commented out code so that we just have our event listener and so on. And now in between we need a couple of other functions which we can kick off when our game started. When the game started, we want to let the user choose whether he wants to use rock, paper, or scissors. That's the game, right? Now, for that, we can add a new function, and I'll use that approach where I store it in a constant. Again, totally optional. Though for now, I would recommend that you also use that, because we'll tweak this a little bit in a second. So I'll create a constant and name it getPlayerChoice, because this effectively is now my function name, so it should also be named like you would name functions. And I'll store an anonymous function in there. Now getPlayerChoice should show a prompt to the user asking for rock, paper, or scissors, right? So we can get a selection stored in a constant by using the prompt function, which is built into JavaScript, and ask for rock, paper, or scissors. And provide a default value of an empty string. So now that will open a prompt to the user when we call that function and store the result in selection. Now obviously, the user could enter anything in there, so I want to check if selection is not equal to rock, and selection also is not equal to paper, and selection also is not equal to scissors. If that's the case, and we can structure this across multiple lines and avoid typos here, so if we add this if check, and we make it into this if block here, I know that something invalid was entered, because the user obviously neither entered rock, nor paper, nor scissors. So in that case, I want to let the user know that he or she made an invalid choice, and that will use some default for him or her. Of course, we could let the user choose again, but I want to use a default in that case. We chose rock for you. Let's say rock is our default here. Now, a little adjustment right away. I want to work with some constants, some global constants here, so that when I use rock, paper, and scissors as words in my if statements, I can't introduce typos. That's a pattern I showed you in the control structures module. So here I just will introduce some global constants. Selection rock, which is rock, or maybe just rock actually. We can shorten this. And duplicate this, and then also here have paper, and also here have scissors. And the advantage of this is that now here I can use rock, here I can use paper, and here I can use scissors, and I can't mistype. And we can even use that here in our template literal and ask for rock. Now, of course, the user has to enter this all in capital cases. Paper or scissors. Now, to make sure that we don't dismiss a choice as invalid just because the user maybe entered rock instead of rock, we can actually also convert the entire string the user entered to all capital case. And we can do so by calling to uppercase on the return value of prompt. Now, the return value of prompt is a string, as you learned. And as you learned, objects can have functions, can have methods. Now, you also learned that strings are primitive values and not really objects, but in that same video where you learned this, I mentioned that you can still access certain properties and functions on these primitive values, and they're kind of temporarily used as objects, you could say. It's a bit more complex. JavaScript does this behind the scenes for us, so we can use them like objects, but they're not really objects. That's how you can think about it. So a string is a primitive value, but it still has this toUpperCase method, which it exposes to us. So it exposes this method to us, and what this method does is it returns a new string where all characters have been converted to uppercase characters. So what we store in selection will be a string with only uppercase characters, and then we can use that here in that if check. So in here, we now check for a valid selection, and if the selection is invalid, we let the user know that we chose rock for him or her, So actually we can use a template literal here as well and output rock here as well. Maybe even create a new constant, default user choice, and set this equal to rock, so that here I refer to that, and if we ever would want to change that default choice, we only have to do it up here. And with that, we validated this. Of course, I now want to return here. So here I can return rock, or to be precise, default user choice. Otherwise, if we don't make it in here, I want to return selection, which should be rock, paper, or scissors. So now here in this anonymous function, we can call getPlayerChoice, and this will return us whatever the user chose or that default selection. And hence here I'll store this in a new constant named playerSelection, which is now a local constant of this anonymous function. So for now, let's just log this here and see whether it works. So let's log the playerSelection here and have a look at that. If we save this, we go back and we reload this page here, click on Start Game, and we get this prompt. And if I enter something here and click OK, I get invalid choice. We chose rock for you, and hence rock is being printed here. If we reload this and I click again, and I enter rock here, I get rock. And just to prove that also something else works, if I enter paper here, I get paper. So that works. Now before we continue, I also want to make sure that once we started a game, we can't start another game. And for this, I'll add a global variable, game is running, and set this to false initially, but set it to true in this anonymous function, game is running, set it to true. But also here, before I set this to true, check if game is running. And if the game is running, and we don't need to add equal true here, because there already is a boolean in game is running, or something which can be coerced to a boolean value, but it already is a boolean. So we'll make it in here if game is running is true, and then I just want to return, so that when we click the button again and again, we don't start new games. Of course, right now we're not doing too much in our game though, so that's something we'll have to change, but we'll get there. So we started the game, we allowed the user to make a selection. The next step, of course, is that the computer also is able to make a selection. Before we do that, however, let's see how else we can create functions, because it turns out there is yet another way of creating a function.